much for having me. Thank you to everybody for coming, and thank you for letting me do this in English, a language I like very much. If I did it in Arabic, it would be entertaining, but I'm not sure you would learn as much. What I want to focus on is, heard, is about the Islamist movements in Arab politics. And I say this as a political scientist, having just written a book, the title of which is, the original title that I wanted to call it was Participation, Not Domination. And in fact, the Arabic edition of the book is called Al-Musharaka al-Mukhalifa, which was the slogan by which the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt entered election campaigns in order to communicate to other political actors, especially to the Mubarak regime, that it was not trying to displace the Mubarak regime. It was simply trying to participate, not to take over the political system. And last year, I had a meeting with Khairat Shatter, who was the Deputy General Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, who had helped me with some of the work earlier. I presented him with a copy of the book, and a young aide who was with him looked at the title of the book, Al-Musharaka al-Mukhalifa, and said to me, "Oh, but now now we're dominating." And in fact, that's a little bit of the question, I think, for Arab political systems today. When the book came out in English, the title, after some argument with the publisher, was called "When Victory is Not an Option." And of course, victory is an option right now. We see, even as we speak, the Muslim Brotherhood has nominated a presidential candidate, Mohammed Morsi, who probably has as strong a possibility as any other of winning the Egyptian presidential race. And they have a just short of majority in the Egyptian parliament. So one way to respond to the situation in terms of my own scholarship is simply to call myself no longer a political scientist, but now a historian. I'm simply dealing with the past. But what I'm going to try and do instead this morning is to try and take a look at Islamist movements based on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. In my work, I focused on Muslim Brotherhood movements in Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, and Kuwait. Try and understand how it was that they grew up and, in some sense, learned their political lessons under what I would call semi-authoritarian conditions. So I'll take a little bit a look at the movements themselves, a little bit under the regimes in which they operate, and then try to move into the future and see how that experience will inform their behavior in the new political environment, especially in Egypt. So let me begin with just talking about the Muslim Brotherhood. If you were to talk to a Muslim Brotherhood member in any of these countries and ask them what is the organization about, the word, of course, if you were to ask them, could you sum up the organization's aims or purpose in one word? The word might be Islam or something like that, but there would be another word that they would use probably much more frequently, and that word would be reform. And if you follow that up with a question, well, reform of what? Reform of education, reform of religion, reform of politics, reform of society, reform of the person, reform of the family. The answer would be yes. Okay. They consciously proud themselves as being comprehensive movements, and they use this phrase over and over. We are a comprehensive movement with a comprehensive vision. The other way that I like to illustrate this is with the motto of the Muslim Brotherhood. The motto that everybody knows, the slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood that everybody knows is Islam is the solution. In fact, as far as I can tell, the Muslim Brotherhood began using that in political campaigns sometime in the 1980s, and it's actually trying to get away from using it today because it alienates some people. So it's really a slogan that you can basically date from the mid-'80s until probably a year or two ago. Although they still use it, but not nearly as much. The older slogan of the movement, the one that is actually on the emblem of the movement, if you take a look at it, is a slogan that is very, very different. It is not Islam is a solution. The slogan is, and I will give it first in English and then in Arabic, the slogan is, be prepared, which is identical to the slogan of the Boy Scouts. In Arabic, it's Ra'du, which is, of course, Quranic as well, but it is also the one that is used by Boy Scout units in some Arab societies. So why is it that the Muslim Brotherhood is drawing its slogan not only from the Quran, but also from the Boy Scout movement? And the answer, historically, is quite simple. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the movement, was very aware of contemporary youth movements. This was youth movements, and he wanted to form something along that line, but something that was going to be broader, something that was not simply going to be aimed at youth, but at people of all generations, and something that was not primarily a political movement when it began. So what the Muslim Brotherhood is about, then, is an organization that sees its job as comprehensive reform. It is unsurprising that politics becomes part of their reform mission. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt starts getting involved in politics, and it's formed in 1920. In the 30s, it gets involved in minor ways. If you look at them in other countries, in Jordan, Kuwait, when they're founded in the 40s and 50s, Palestine, they do get involved in politics, but it is almost never the primary focus of their activity. Whenever you have free parliamentary elections in these countries, early on, Muslim Brotherhood candidates run, and they sometimes win, but usually it's 2 or 3 seats. It's basically as part of a broader reform agenda rather than the primary focus of their efforts. The effect, as I like to say, is to make the Muslim Brotherhood, I'm not sure they would appreciate this analogy or this metaphor, but a little bit like a toothpaste tube, right? If you squeeze it in one area, it comes out somewhere else. And so basically what the Muslim Brotherhood is a comprehensive reform movement, is something that has all kinds of different activities. And as Arab politics begins to close down in the 1950s in some countries, or 1960s or wherever, they have other activities that they can do. So that's what the Brotherhood is about, a comprehensive reform movement, obviously one that has the basis, its ideology on a religious basis, but it has to be seen, and I think we have to take this seriously as what their goal is. Now, what about the regimes under which they were operating? When the Brotherhood was founded, it was founded in Egypt. It was sort of an unstable constitutional monarchy. But it managed to survive and sustain itself. I mean, if you think about it, this is one of the few political, non-governmental political organizations in the Arab world that manages to outlive and reproduce itself, even as its founders pass on to the next world. This is something that is not all that usual in the Arab world. So it manages to sustain itself, and it manages to sustain itself under what I'm calling semi-authoritarian conditions. And what I mean by semi-authoritarianism is this. If you go back to the 1950s and 1960s, and you take a look at the political systems that existed in places like Egypt or that emerged in Syria or Iraq, you see very sharply authoritarian systems, single-party states, very tight control over the press, all media owned by the state, and very sharp limits on what can be said and what cannot be said, very sharp limits on political and even social organization and so forth and so on. In a lot of countries, including the ones that I'm dealing with, that system begins to relax a little bit. In Egypt, beginning in the 1970s. In Jordan, a little bit more, I would say, in the late 1980s. In Kuwait, I would say probably after liberation, 1991. Palestine is a little bit of a special case that I'm dealing with, but in some ways, although the Israeli occupation is harsh in all kinds of ways, because it is a foreign occupation or seen by Palestinians as alien, that limits the degree to which it really can control the political and social space in Palestinian society. And so in all these places, what you have is what I would call a semi-authoritarian system, one which allows for some greater freedom of expression, some greater freedom of organization, an end to a single-party system. Opposition parties can sometimes form. And what you have is, in many of these societies, is a system where the rules of the political game seem to shift from year to year. From 1 year, for instance, it might be considered, or sometimes even shift from person to person. Some people can get away with speaking an awful lot more freely. Other people cannot. Sometimes you can get around with saying whatever you want, but you can't organize. And so the rules of the political game constantly shift. You might be able to criticize the government, but not the head of state. You might be able to criticize policies, but not people. And again, the rules of the political game constantly shift, but there is one overriding rule in semi-authoritarian politics in these Arab states that is constant from year to year, that does not change, and that is the opposition loses. Right? Or in other words, what I would say is the message to political opposition is You can run in elections, you just can't win them. So that's kind of the environment that exists in Egypt from the 1970s on, when the opposition is allowed to form political organizations. As soon as a political organization looks like it's developing a real constituency, for instance, you have a leftist opposition party in Egypt, the Gamwa, that begins to try to build links with organized labor in the country, then sharp constraints come down. So that's essentially the political system that operates in these places. Now, what I think is notable about this is, in a sense, the Muslim Brotherhood as I've described it, and semi-authoritarian politics as I've described it, basically seem to be almost made for each other. Because if you're a political opposition party in Jordan, or in Kuwait, or in Egypt, and you want to mobilize your constituents, what are you going to be able to offer them? What are you going to be able to say? You have to put up sometimes with oppression, arrest, perhaps being dismissed from your job. And in fact, most people get very disenchanted from the political game. Political parties are extremely weak in these places. They have very little to offer their own followers. They have very little ability to organize their constituents. The Brotherhood, by contrast, or Islamist groups that are modeled on this, do have something else to do. Remember the toothpaste tube metaphor. When the political environment is shut down, they have other places and other ways to organize their constituents. So it's a social movement. Because it's primarily a social movement and not a political party, it can sustain itself under semi-authoritarian conditions and gauge how much to participate in political life from election to election. And that's exactly what it did. Over the last few years, when I've been doing research in Islamist movements in these places, what I will often ask is, how many seats are you going to contest in the next election? And the answer always is very, very interesting. It's very carefully thought through, and it's based on how many seats the movement thinks is going to be allowed to win. And you have this very, very strange environment in which the Islamist movement generally knows that it can mobilize voters, but the extent to which it can do so, the greater extent to which it does so, the greater the likelihood of official repression. So that if what they generally would do would be to figure out how many seats are we going to be allowed to win, and then we will run that many. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in the 2005 electoral campaign decided that it would not contest more than 1/3 of the seats. Where did it come up with this number? Because if it contested more than 1/3 of the seats, it could have a group in parliament that could block any attempt to amend the Egyptian constitution. In other words, from the Brotherhood perspective, that would be, in essence, entering a position of political power and political authority. And that would be a threat to the regime, and it was a responsibility that the movement did not want to take. So you have movements that deliberately run in election campaigns in order to lose them. Why even run at all? Because this is, in some cases, a much more free environment for them to propagate their message than elsewhere. They run not necessarily to exercise political authority over the short run under these conditions, but in order to organize more freely, in order to communicate to the broad society that we have this comprehensive vision, we have a political program, we have answers on economic issues, we have answers on cultural issues, and so forth and so on. When these parties develop electoral campaign or platforms, political party platforms, what is remarkable is how long and detailed they are. And basically what happens in some of these countries is that the Islamist movement get very, very tired of being told, you're just using religion as a slogan, you have a detailed program. And so they say, you want a detailed program, we will give you 100 pages or more of policy proposals. You want to know what the Muslim Brotherhood thinks about cell phone monopolies. You want to know what it thinks about medical care, and they go on and on. So what politics in semi-authoritarian conditions allows them is a little bit more freedom to operate, a little bit more freedom to organize, a little bit more freedom to develop this comprehensive vision, and no threat of winning. No threat of having to actually worry about having to govern. I said that one of the questions that I would ask in interviews of leaders would be how many seats are you going to run in the next election? I would ask this once in 2007 in Jordan of the Islamic Action Front, a political wing of the Brotherhood in Jordan. Asked the leader, how many seats do you intend to run in the upcoming election? And he answered not with a number, but with a sentence. We will never repeat the disaster of Hamas. And for many Muslim Brotherhood organizations, what Hamas did was it broke the rule. It decided to run and it decided to win. Or actually, it's interesting because I was trying to figure out from the Hamas leaders themselves, when did you decide to win the election, the 2006 Palestinian parliamentary elections? And the answer, I am convinced, is they never did make this decision. They entered the elections knowing that they would not be allowed to win, and then realized a couple months before that winning was actually a possibility. But never, unless they're lying, never really had a senior policy discussion among top leaders about whether to pursue victory or not. They got sucked into victory, and from the perspective of many Islamist movements in the region, made a mistake by not pulling back. Because by breaking the rule, they broke the system. What they did was they broke the Palestinian political system, which was not prepared to bear an Islamist victory, and internationally as well. So when you talk to Brotherhood leaders in places like Jordan or Kuwait and so on, they will hold up Hamas as a negative example. Of course, they will talk about things like the Israeli decision to arrest Hamas parliamentarians, or what they say the American veto about Hamas participating in government. Of course, they think this is unjust, but they also will very frankly say that Hamas itself made a mistake by putting itself in a position where it exposed itself to this possibility. And of course, Algeria as well, is in the background of their thinking. That's what happens if you try to push too hard to win. So that's what Islamist movements are about. That's what semi-authoritarian politics is about. And that's how, in a sense, they could kind of feed off each other. And then we come to 2011, and things change. And they change most in Egypt, so that's where I'm going to focus my remarks. The Brotherhood confused people in the Egyptian Revolution, right? In January 25th, there's going to be demonstrations. Nobody knows how many Egyptians are going to show up. And the question is the Brotherhood going to call out its supporters? If the Brotherhood calls out its people, these demonstrations will become huge. And the regime will probably treat these not as annoying demonstrations, but as a mortal threat to the regime. So the Brotherhood has a very tough decision to make. Does it call out its supporters to participate in these demonstrations, or does it not? And the answer on January 25th was very classic Muslim Brotherhood. Well, they said the Muslim Brotherhood will not participate in these demonstrations as an organization. However, individual members of the Brotherhood are free to do as they like. They tried to have it both ways. And when it was clear what size the demonstrations would be, suddenly the Brotherhood changed tack and said by January 28th, we are now participating as an organization. And in my mind, that was when it was actually at that point that people started talking about the Egyptian Revolution. The word revolution was used because a protest movement like that with Brotherhood numbers behind it was one that could perhaps bring down the regime. At which point, the regime began to try to reach out and pick off members of the opposition. And they invited opposition leaders to negotiate. And most opposition leaders said, it is too late for that. You either meet our demands or you do not meet our demands. But we're not going to have to play the game of playing us off against each other. The exception, of course, is the Muslim Brotherhood, which shows up to negotiate with Omar Suleiman, who is momentarily vice president in this period. Again, the Brotherhood, people will complain about the Brotherhood not being trustworthy. To me, this is a Brotherhood that does not know what to do, and therefore tries to do both things at the same time. As a political actor would be, they've got a political strategy and a political approach that is designed for semi-authoritarian politics. And they want to, at the one hand, bring about fundamental political change. On the other hand, they're very concerned about the health of the continued viability of the organization. organization. And they are very well aware that if this revolution fails, they will probably bear a bigger brunt, a bigger price than anybody else. I remember talking to a Brotherhood leader back in the earlier protest movement, the Kafaya movement in Egypt in 2005, 2006. And the Kafaya leaders, this umbrella coalition of opposition movements, would say that the problem with the Brotherhood is you can't count on them because they say they're part of the movement, but then we call a demonstration, nobody from the Brotherhood shows up. So I asked Brotherhood leaders about this, and their answer was frank and direct, and to me made some sense. They said, look, when people, leftists from Kafaya show up for a demonstration, they get arrested, beaten up, and released. When we show up, we get arrested, put in jail, put on military trials, and put in jail for 5 years. Essentially, there's a sense, I think, among Brotherhood leaders that they had this organization that they had inherited from a couple generations ago that would date back to the days of Hassan al-Banna, that it was their job to pass on to the next generation. And they would say all the time, we think in terms of generations, we don't think in terms of day-to-day tactics. So that's a lot of the odd behavior of the Brotherhood during the revolution itself. And even after the revolution, all of a sudden there was an opportunity to participate fairly fully in elections. So again, what the Brotherhood did was, I think, react very uncertainly at first. The question was, are you going to form a political party? Are you going to fully devote yourself to political life? Is the Muslim Brotherhood going to file and get status as a political party? And the Brotherhood answered this question in, again, this way that basically showed, I think, its hesitation or its worry about committing itself to any particular path. The Muslim Brotherhood itself said, we are not going to form ourselves as a political party, but we will sponsor a political party. We will set up this political party, and after it is set up, people can join it, whether they're from the Brotherhood or not from the Brotherhood, and we will simply set it up and let it do as it wants. So it was going to be essentially an Islamist party that was going to be kind of, the idea was it would be sort of a sort of socially conservative religious party that would not be restricted to Brotherhood members. And then they said, and by the way, just to make sure, just to help it get off the ground, we're going to give this party a gift. We're going to write its platform, and we're going to take 3 members of our guidance bureau, that basically the 16 people who run the Muslim Brotherhood, and give them as the leadership of the party. So that rather than setting up an independent political party, what they had was a party that was seen to be absolutely melded to the movement because they were worried about it getting so sucked into politics. That was Egyptian politics about a year ago. And again, you can see some of their decisions. They said, we will not run a presidential candidate. They said, we will participate in elections, but we'll try to get only about 30% of the seats. To me, what has happened over the last year or so is, in a sense, the experiment, or the experience of Hamas in slow motion. Hamas suddenly discovered it won in January 2006, and what has happened over the last year is the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has become sucked more and more and more into politics. And I think that is going to be a challenge for Egypt, and it's going to be a challenge for the Brotherhood. And I don't know how either will fare. So let me talk about why it's a challenge for Egypt and why it's a challenge for the Brotherhood. It's a challenge for Egypt because you have, in essence, in Egypt, one single political party right now, the Muslim Brotherhood, or the Freedom and Justice Party. There is no other. I mean, you do have a Salafi party, the Northern Party, but it's not really a viable organization. You have leftist parties, secular parties, and so on, but they really have no real constituents. They're not able to mobilize people. If you look at the Egyptian presidential race today, for instance, and you take a look at the list of candidates, you see something absolutely remarkable. Who are the leading candidates? Ahmed Shafiq has no party behind him. Ahmed Mahmoud Fatouh was kicked out of the Brotherhood, has no party behind him. Ahmed Musa, former Secretary General of the Arab League, well known, but no party behind him. Mohammed Morsi is a man who's the nominee of the Brotherhood, is virtually unknown as an individual in Egypt. And yet, he has a very strong party behind him. So the problem for Egypt is that they've got one political party that essentially, I think, is going to be close to a majority in any election. They could win the presidency. Even if they lose it, they've got close to a majority in parliament. It is going to be impossible, I think, to avoid the Brotherhood in any kind of democratic system that arises. And the real problem for Egypt is, can you find opposition political forces or other political forces that will be viable. Because any political system where you have one dominant party, whether it's you have the PRI, which dominated for a long time in Mexico, or the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, any political system, regardless of what that political party is like, is not a healthy competitive environment. If you define a democratic system in procedural terms as a political system in which you have, in a sense, institutionalized uncertainty, you do not know the results in advance, and you have one single dominant political party, you're not going to have a democratic system for long, no matter how democratic or not democratic that party is. So it's to me, it's a real challenge for Egypt to try and figure out what is it, the limits of what the majority can do, what for instance, what authorities the parliament will have, what authorities it will have over Egyptian institutions, whether it's military, security, judiciary, and so on, and whether or not you can have a countervailing force, any kind of other political force. It's also a big problem for the Brotherhood, and for that, I think you have to go back to the purpose of the organization as I described it. This is a comprehensive reform movement. And in this sense, I think the current moment is an incredible opportunity for them, right? They can operate much more freely. They will taste political power in Egypt for the first time ever. And yet, political power may be so tasty, they may forget about all other parts of their mission. If you go to the headquarters of the Freedom and Justice Party, Brotherhood political party in Cairo today, you find the busiest place in a country that is crowded and busy at all times. This set of offices is extremely crowded and busy. If you go to the movement headquarters, which is up in Cotton Hills, overlooking Cairo, you find a sleepy set of offices full of old men who are waiting for visitors to come by and talk to them. And when I went by to talk to them a few months ago, I asked a member of the Guidance Bureau, after the revolution you were talking about setting up youth clubs, labor unions, and so forth and so on. How are those plans progressing? And he just looked at me, looked very, very tired, and said, that's very hard. And the best minds of the movement have gone over to the political party. This number two of the movement, who and perhaps the most influential decision maker within the movement, is still with the movement. He didn't go over to the political party, and yet it's clear he spends all of his time on politics. So the other activities of the movement seem to be kind of declining. And I think that is a big challenge for the movement. You see what the possible fate of a movement like this when you take a look at what Hamas has done in Gaza. When Hamas won the 2006 parliamentary elections, they were very, very clear. They were going to be the un-Fatah. They were going to do, if they would look and see what Fatah did in the 1990s and do the precise opposite. So, for instance, the first thing Fatah did was hire all of its supporters and take all of its big leaders and make them ministers and so forth and so on. And Hamas said, okay, you go into a Hamas-led government, you resign your position as a leader in the movement. You're a member of parliament, and you want to go to parliament, you take public transportation. No limousines for us, no special security passes for us. When Mahmoud Zahar was the foreign minister, he was basically barred from much international travel because of the international boycott. But when he was invited to Turkey and to Russia, he flew coach. He refused business class. Okay, this was what they were trying to communicate: that they were above that they were not going to wed themselves to political power. They were not going to allow themselves to be corrupted. You take a look at Hamas in Gaza right now. The leader of the movement right now, perhaps the most influential member, is Ismail Haniyeh, who is not simply a Hamas leader, but also a prime minister. You take a look at how they get around, and they're not taking public transportation anymore. You take a look at a movement that is basically very wedded to political authority in Gaza. So that if the Gaza government were to collapse, if Hamas rule in Gaza were to be challenged in any way, it would be a real harm to the movement. And the movement, which has said from the beginning, we are the Islamic resistance movement. Resistance is literally our middle name. Is conducting much more governing and worried far more about things like revenue collection than it is about the broad Hamas mission. That to me is a negative example for the Brotherhood in Egypt and other places where they need to participate in government. What they really have to decide is how much they really are about politics and how much they're really about broad reform. And in my mind, they're making these decisions. They claim historically that they think in terms of generations. They're making these decisions right now on a week-to-week basis. Their decision to run a presidential candidate, I think, was a moment of sudden panic on their part when they felt that they were about to have a political position challenged. So my sense is it's a critical moment, as I say, not simply for Egypt, but also for the Brotherhood. For Egypt, it's going to be how to assimilate this large and powerful movement as a normal political actor, and for the Brotherhood, it's going to be how to figure out how the politics relates to their comprehensive mission. I'm actually slightly optimistic for Egypt. My hunch is you will have a more democratic and pluralistic Egyptian political system that eventually emerges from this. For the Brotherhood, I think it will be a little bit more difficult. If I were to guess, what I would say is the analogy that I would use would be the analogy when people from the Brotherhood, and this is not just Egypt, anywhere else, who talk to Western audiences, and they try to sort of communicate what they're about in non-threatening terms, the analogy that they would use would be, the question they always would be asked, are you like the Nazis? Are you going to just run for political office and then take over the political system? Or are you going to try and construct the Iranian model? And the answer was always no. We're something that you, Europeans or Americans, should be much more familiar with. We're a conservative political party. We are like the Christian Democrats. Okay, perfectly at home in democratic politics, but with a conservative message that is based on religious teachings. And I think that analogy is actually a very good one, but not if you look at the Christian Democrats of the post-war era, if you look at Christian democracy of 100 years ago. When Christian democracy began in Europe, it was the same kind of challenge to the political system. Because what they wanted, the term Christian democracy was used as an opposition to liberal democracy. And they wanted to ensure, for instance, that the education system remained in religious hands. They wanted to, and they knew that they had very, very strong popular support. There was a similar kind of struggle that went on among the ancestors of today's Social Democratic Party, which are now sort of tame left-leaning parties in most European countries. You go back 100 years ago, and Social Democrats had very strong arguments. Do we participate in politics or not? What is the relationship between revolutionary activity and running elections? If we run elections, do we get so seduced by the prospect of getting a majority that we begin to forget our ideology? And to me, that's the stage at which the Muslim Brotherhood is at. If you have stable political systems that emerge, what my sense is that the Muslim Brotherhood will become a little bit more like those parties over time, gradually assimilated into a political system, so that if the generation that founded the Muslim Brotherhood were to wake up, they would say, you won political power, you won ministerial positions, you've done all these sorts of wonderful things, but you may have forgotten very important parts of our mission. So to the extent that they succeed politically, they may face ideological problems and problems with the broader reform mission. And so I guess on that kind of optimistic note for Egypt, but pessimistic note for the Brotherhood, well, I want to.
common question from this lot of asking is about the political Islam phenomenon. We have till now two schools. In Tunisia, we have the first experience after the first experience of the Arab Muslim war, in the Arab world, about reconciliation between Islamists and secular. Do you think that in Egypt, we have the chance to move to political parties, civilian political parties, and civilian political state? Not even if the main leaders have religious background or secular background, as a precondition to succeed in the West.
Just about your last comment, you said that, what is happening in Egypt, in terms of about the development of Muslim parties and the Muslim world would expect it. We can compare it with what happened in Europe about Christian parties and so on. But I think maybe the picture is complicated by the focus point of the Sharia, bringing the Sharia into the system of a new state building process. And so maybe this one can also complicate this kind of analogy that you said is a good one.
I deliberately left Tunisia out of this for two reasons. Number one, I don't know very much about the place, and there are people here who obviously live here, so I should be very modest. And yesterday, he gave a talk, and I made a couple remarks that sounded optimistic about Tunisia, and people who knew Tunisia well wanted to push back. No, you don't understand. All of the problems that we have. So I don't want to sound excessively optimistic about Tunisia. But when I compare it to Egypt, what I see is this: you have an election result that really forced some kind of consensus politics, and that's what would be best for Egypt. You have other political forces here that have some electoral presence. You have, a trade union movement, which has some kind of independence, which doesn't exist yet in Egypt. It's trying to emerge. So in those kinds of ways, Tunisia, I think, could be a positive model. In terms of a civil state, it's very interesting. Right now, in Egypt, the non-Islamists will refer to themselves as, they can't call themselves liberals because it's a bad word. They can't call themselves secularists because it's a bad word in Egypt. They call themselves the Medines, the civilians or whatever. I'm not quite sure how you would even translate the civil political forces. At the same time, the Brotherhood itself refers to itself as we are a civil political force with an Islamic reference. I see some moving towards a kind of common ground there. It is one that I think will be very religious and conservative coloration. But what I will say simply is that I guess as an American, I'm used to this. I think the two sets of politicians who talk about religion more than anybody else in the world are Arab politicians and American politicians. The idea that you draw on religious teachings, that you expect political leaders to be personally devout, that they talk about about religious themes in political discourse, this is accepted in the United States. I'll get back to the point of Sharia, because to me that's the key. In the United States, it is, I mean, I guess we'll move this question to the last. In the United States, this is a very generic kind of, it's about religious teachings, it's about kind of values. When you get very specific, or politicians are not expected to be specific. Here, an Islamist movement, by definition, I think, is calling for using Sharia in public life. And that sounds, at first glance, very, very specific. What we want is a political system in which law is derived from religious sources. However, as you look upon what people mean by that in practice, it's not necessarily all that different. And here there has been, I think, a development in a lot of Islamist thought towards what I would say is first implementing Sharia through the democratic system. In other words, it's not you have a group of scholars who are deciding what Sharia is. This has to be legislated by Parliament. It has to be implemented through a regular legal system. You do it through regular constitutional texts, human written constitutional texts and so on. And second, there is a great emphasis on understanding, the maqasid of the Sharia, or Islamic reference mark, and this sort of thing, really move from the specific to the general, so that the Sharia becomes sort of an overall framework. You would say, rather than a very kind of specific set of laws that are supposed to be immediately applied. That's the direction of most thought right now, and that makes it possible to think in terms of this kind of civil state Islamic references, this kind of. Now, what it will look like in practice, I don't know, but that's the direction which people are thinking. The relationship between the Salafis and the Brotherhoods is a wonderful question. It's one that I think is fascinating and changes from week to week. If you go back before the revolution, then what you see is I think, a sort of separate Brotherhood and Salafi approaches, but ones kind of could sometimes overlap. There was a trend within the Brotherhood that were more friendly to Salafi thought. There were some within the Salafi who basically said, look, we don't necessarily do politics, we'll do politics with the Brotherhood. So there was some kind of overlap. I think right now there's very strong connection between the two. If you talk to any Salafi leader for more than 30 seconds, you will hear the following sentence. The Brotherhood isn't about religion, it's about politics. Okay? And if you talk to anybody from the Brotherhood, you will hear a similar kind of, the Salafis, they spend all their time buried with their nose in texts. We are out there in society. We're members of society. We're not trying to create a small group of devout people. We're really trying to be out there and serve the entire society. And so there's kind of a clash between them and a rivalry. And my sense is, when I talked about the challenge for the Brotherhood in the coming phase, when the Brotherhood thinks about it, when the Brotherhood leaders think about it, they think their main political challenge right now is the military, other political forces, and so on. Their main social challenge are the Salafis. They will talk very explicitly. Essentially, they stole our people. Though the people that the Salafis are organizing and are attracting over to their point of view are ones that should logically have come and joined the Brotherhood, but they didn't because we were being repressed under Mubarak. And so there's a very strong competition that takes place, I think, on not so much on a political level, but on a social level. And so I think we're going to see that competition grow. The one thing that could limit it will be the political system. That is to say, if the Brotherhood feels deprived of political power, that it has won electorally, it will be driven into an alliance with the Salafis. It's one they want to avoid very much, but when they, for instance, if they want to get something through the Egyptian Parliament right now, where they are just short of a majority, they need to have somebody else sign on to their program. And they would much rather have it not be the Salafis, but if all the other political forces, the civil
Let me ask you two questions. First one is about the relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military in Egypt. As you mentioned that the Muslim Brotherhood are more about a comprehensive reformist movement. So how you see the future in Egypt if this relationship between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood. Second question is about the position of the Muslim Brotherhood vis-à-vis Israel. Becoming, if the Muslim Brotherhood takes all the power in Egypt, how do you think they will deal with that?
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. My question pertains to the information campaign that the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is currently conducting in Western nations. For example, in the United States last month, they had a group of young Egyptian women who were giving lectures. My question is, what is your opinion on the goals and the direction of the Muslim Brotherhood? Are there goals to change the perceptions and misconceptions about the Muslim Brotherhood? Is it to obtain legitimacy?
Yes. In a very strange way, the relationship with the military, the position on Israel, the information campaign, in a very strange way, this is all the same question. Okay? And I'll explain why. I guess let me sort of go in order. There is this, I think there's a strong sense within the Brotherhood that this is their opportunity. But they have to be very, very careful in picking fights. And again, the example of Hamas was very, very heavily on them. So, and the example of Algeria as well. So, the relationship with the military, go to that first. Tense, but fundamentally there is people talk about secret deal between the Brotherhood and the military. I don't think there was a secret deal. There is, however, a deal that is not so secret, an agreement that is not so secret, that is essentially on the table. And it goes something like this. The military will essentially return full political authority to civil political forces, including the Brotherhood, at the conclusion of the presidential election. I think that's going to happen. But the military has a continued voice in security affairs and has only very loose civilian oversight. And the Brotherhood is comfortable with that, short to medium term. But I will tell you something very interesting that I noticed happening in my interviews with the Brotherhood over the last year. It was, they got very busy. We talked to somebody who's on the political wing of the Brotherhood, where they used to have an hour for you, they now have 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm used to conducting interviews very, very quickly. But then something interesting would happen. At the end of all my interviews, after I was done with talking to a member of parliament or a member of the political leadership, I would say, thank you very much, and then the person would say, sit back down. We have some questions for you. And the questions are about two things. The questions are about how do you have civilian oversight of the military in the United States? How is it, for instance, that in the Congress you have oversight committees for the intelligence service? How do these operate? They're very, very detailed questions, none of which I can answer. Okay, so the interview still concludes very quickly. But they are very explicit. They are thinking medium and long term. They are not backward looking when it comes to the Mubarak trial, for instance, or when it comes to trials of generals for some of the violence that has taken place over the last year. That's not the Brotherhood's issue. The past is not the problem. They're very future oriented, and what they say they want right now is just the principle of civilian oversight. When the military looks like it wants to enshrine in the Constitution a permanent political role for the military, they say no. But they're perfectly happy with an interim situation in which the military is essentially running the time. So they're thinking really 5 to 10 to 20 years. The The second thing that they ask about is, how do we reach a Western audience? Should we open up an office in Washington? These are the kinds of questions that they're interested in. So what is their goal? I think a sense that, they don't want to push harder than the domestic system will bear, and the domestic system has to do with other political forces in the military, and they don't want to push harder than the international system will bear. And so the leadership of the Brotherhood has basically made a decision: we need to open up a dialogue with the United States, and that has actually done very, very quickly on an official level. And so visiting American congressmen have regular contact with the Brotherhood. They go by to pay visits. There's contact with the embassy, but they need to do it on a popular level as well. So the people that they sent, it was interesting. The people they sent, they were young people, okay, and they sent young people. What it was is I'm at the Carnegie Hall. We actually hosted. We were the ones who invited them, and they sent people who you could and Americans could connect very, very easily with. Right, they're AUC grads and this sort of thing. They seem very attractive, and they're very articulate. They're not the decision makers of the organization. This is what I know from talking to them. They were very effective spokesmen, but they could not, if you press them, they have no instructions on details. Okay? The decisions are made from us. So this is a public relations campaign. I think they were trying to test the waters to see what happens. If it goes well, then maybe we will send our major leaders over. But we're not ready for that. For that quite yet. Interestingly, not that they're almost the exact opposite, right? Khanushi came to the United States last year. Nobody from the senior leadership of the Brotherhood has come yet to the United States. I think they want to take this slowly. And they want essentially how to learn how to talk. And this, by the way, has been wonderful for me for my research, because I think when I show up at Egypt, I think, oh, here's an opportunity to practice talking to an American, and we'll see what kind of questions we get asked. So that kind of what is that? Now, this brings me to the question of the position on Israel. Their emotional position is very, very clear. Support for the Palestine cause is hardwired into the Brotherhood since the 1930s. Okay? So it is clear where their sympathies lie. It's with Hamas, it's with the Palestinians, it's with Gaza, and this is an emotional issue. It's clear where their hearts are. Their heads are somewhere else, okay? And again, it has to do with the sense that this could be a make or break issue with the international community. And you could see them try to work this out, try to, in a sense, square the circle between their emotional attachment and their positions with, in a sense, as one young brother member explained it to me this way, that we have to learn to think like a state. States have treaties. States have international obligations. You can't just say that was the old government and so the treaty doesn't work anymore. So the Brotherhood managed to work out a position on this, which was, and you can hear this from Brotherhood members, and they recite it. It's like, the Brotherhood will honor international obligations. The peace treaty with Israel did not serve Egyptian interests, and it is legitimate to reopen negotiations when the treaty does not serve the interest. But this has to be bilateral, that we will do so in accordance with international law. We're not going to go to war. We're not going to disregard our international commitments. They will all say that language in virtually identical. What varies from one member to another is whether those words are easy or difficult to say. For some of them, they just come out like this, and for others, you can tell they're saying it in spite of themselves. It's like you're watching. I reviewed one member of the Guy Bureau of Muslim Brotherhood, and his face looked like he was in pain when he was saying, "We will honor international obligations," because they were very, very hard. But they mean it, and I think what they mean essentially is this: that their sympathies are clear. This is not a priority for them. You see some signs, I think, of some real impatience and frustration on Hamas's part, saying, "Wait a second, our people are coming to power in Egypt and you're not doing anything for us." But just in sort of sense, we just have to wait. And in some way, we'll find a way to help you. We'll find a way to break the blockade. We'll find a way to have different kind of diplomacy. But we cannot break the international system, because then we will
of